Good morning. Everybody seems very distant. I mean, you're all set back for some reason. Why is this the case? And the podium is way over here and in the dark. But thank you very much for the invitation to join you. It's an incredible honor that you all have given any time to my first book, my humble tome, which in many ways was a kind of gift to me from my ancestors. So by reading that book, I feel honored, but it's an honor to my ancestors. And yesterday, I had maybe the second occasion, I think only ever, when I saw somebody carrying my book. Somebody was standing at the entrance to the library with the book in their hand. It reminded me of one time riding in the New York subway when the book first came out. I saw somebody reading the book on the New York subway. I thought, God, this book is going to be huge. It's like, everybody's going to see this book now. But in fact, it's managed to keep a very low profile until coming back to San Antonio. I moved back to San Antonio in 2005, and after living in New York City for 22 years, figured out that I was writing constantly about the world down here. And I was finding myself writing about South Texas in places like Berlin or frozen upstate New York, literally with piles of snow and ice on the ground outside, and wondering what was wrong with this picture, why I was writing about the world down here but living so far away. So in 2005, I moved back here, and I was fully prepared. I had just gotten a contract for this new book, The Farthest Home is in an Empire of Fire. But I was preparing to finish that book, so I was about halfway done. And in 2005, I made the move, brought all my stuff down here, unpacked my books, was settling in, preparing to complete this new book. And in 2006, out of nowhere, the San Antonio Library Foundation rose Places Left Unfinished from the Dead. They made that book for the first time in San Antonio, One Book, One City project. So 2006, Places Left Unfinished at the time of creation, literally like a zombie, rose from the grave and stalked the earth again and usurped that entire year, delaying a new book, not just by a year, it seemed like maybe another 2 or 3 years. But it gave me a chance to literally have a dialogue with San Antonio about that book, which was something that maybe, it wasn't something I literally dreamt of, but it was a dream that I didn't dare have, because it was too perfect as a way of thinking about that book's path. It was nominated for a National Book Award in 1999 and came out. And it had its own sort of great journey, but the idea that there would be a chance to spend an entire year, literally, talking with San Antonio about San Antonio and about the people in our past. As I mentioned, the idea of San Antonio as a kind of crossroads of cultures, that in San Antonio we are living the reality of what America is becoming. The future of our republic, in many ways, is being prophesied here in San Antonio. And also embodied by our past, the fact that we are rooted both in the epic of the discovery and conquest and colonization of the New World, with all of the complex questions that presents us about who we are, who our ancestors were, but that we're also rooted in the incredible epic of the American Republic. So we're unique among American cities in the depth of our rootedness in these two great stories. And so this book, Places Left Unfinished, really began with the idea that any of us telling the story of our families takes us to not just the great stories of our nations, but the greatest story, the story of our humanity. So, when people have asked, well, what's so special about your family? Why write about the Santos and Garcias? Why write about the Velas and Lopez? It's precisely because we weren't special. We were poor people from North Mexico. We were descendants of the indigenous world, descendants of the Spanish world, and many other nations come into the mix. If you begin to look into your own ancestral history through the lens of genetic science, you'll see that you are ancestored from virtually every part of the planet. Your ancestors were restless and busy and always meeting and mingling with others. So the idea of thinking of ourselves as Mexican or Greek or Irish or African or Lithuanian is just the thinnest patina over the incredible story of our ancestry. So my interest in Places Left Unfinished was trying to tell the story of my father's families, rooted in Mexico and the history that Mexico embodies in the aftermath of conquest. Investigating how we think about our lineages connecting to the Indian world, how we think of our lineages connecting to the Iberian world, the world of the Spaniards, and the Mestizo culture that emerged in Mexico in the aftermath of conquest. The more recent book, The Farthest Home, is in an Empire of Fire, which I subtitled the Tejano Elegy, in many ways has a quarrel with Places Left Unfinished. It has a quarrel about this idea that we can ever name exactly who we are. Because any attempt on our part to define ourselves culturally, nationally, ethnically, racially, is always going to be challenged by the question of, well, who were you before then? Who were your ancestors before they arrived in Mexico? Who were your ancestors before they arrived in Iberia? Who were your ancestors before they came out of Africa? So, in the new book, the story that begins in Places Left Unfinished, which sort of takes us into my family's past through Mexico, it goes farther back and looks at the origins in Spain, the origins of the stories that they carried out of the Middle East, and in a sense kind of lays groundwork for another kind of book. I'm not sure yet what kind of book follows in terms of thinking about the deepest questions about the origins themselves. So this book, it was a book that I actually tell the story about the writing of Places Left Unfinished in the new book, in The Farthest Home. I go back to the time in the early 90s. I've been working in television for a long time and having a secret life as a writer at night and making documentaries during the day, not really telling anybody that I was writing poetry or that I was reading about the Aztec culture by nighttime. And I had a chance to spend a year writing, and I thought I would write this book about all of the changes and metamorphoses of humanity that took place after the conquest. Not just in Mexico, but throughout Latin America, as a way of presenting, particularly I was interested in a work that journalists could use to report more deeply, more fully on the backstory, the deep history of the peoples of Mexico and Latin America. And that book was going to be very historical, very theoretical, and it was incredibly boring. It was But when I would go back and read some of this stuff, I realized that I was much more interested in telling a story about Brown Beauty, the ornery Shetland pony we had on the ranch just south of town that could aim you directly into a stand of cactus before it threw you. Like it's a perfect aim. So I was much more interested in those family stories. And so the writing took a very different direction. I abandoned that other project called Immaterial Empires. So I tell a little bit about that story. And how really, I had to feel my way into this book. There was no guide really for what I wanted to do. And I wasn't really prepared in any way, in any meaningful way. I'd studied philosophy and literature, English literature. Growing up in Texas schools, I wasn't taught about this history that I wanted to write about. I wasn't taught about the complex story of the mestizaje that emerged in Mexico in the aftermath of the conquest, the emergence of what José Vasconcelos, the Mexican philosopher of the early 20th century, called the raza cósmica, the cosmic race, the race that mixes all races that emerged in Mexico. That was not part of the Texas curriculum, high school or junior high school. And right now it's in the process of being scrubbed from the Arizona curriculum, where it's seeped into the Arizona curriculum. They're now trying to excise it and ban the books that tell this story. I feel disrespected that my book didn't get banned in Arizona. I feel like, was I not, caustic enough about this history? So I had to feel my way into this book. It was the early 90s, and back then, memoirs were still, these were books that were written by retired admirals or ambassadors. They were usually in 3 or 4 volumes. They were unreadable. It was an old shipping trunk, of a genre, a literary genre. And, so the idea of writing a memoir wasn't really in mind. It wasn't something that I modeled this book after. Around the same time, Frank McCourt's book, Angela's Ashes, appeared, and Mary Carr's book, Liar's Club, which began to reinvent and reimagine the memoir in significant ways. But I really didn't even identify with those books. I was thinking more about books like the Florentine Codex, Sahagún's, Bernardino de Sahagún, the Franciscan friar who immediately after the conquest, in the period between 1530 and 1550, organizes a studio in Tlatelolco, one of the other capitals of the Triple Alliance of Tenochtitlan in Mexico City, and he begins to create, in a sense, a very profound ethnographic project. Some of the priests recognized that the civilization that had been conquered, whose idols and temples were being destroyed, whose books were being burned in giant bonfires, that this civilization needed to be recorded. And so Sahagún sets out to speak to the elders, to speak to the old mothers, to speak to the old warriors. And the Florentine Codex, the assembled written record of the Florentine Codex, is probably the best chronicle of that civilization which was disappearing, which was being dismantled and literally demolished. So that was more of a model for me, to think about these old books that had sought to recover a tradition that was in the process of being lost, a process that was really unthinking. There was a great deal of culture that the Iberians brought with them that prepared them for what they did in Mexico. Some biblical based beliefs and thought forms, some ideas that derived from their long experience in Iberia, mixing and mingling with Moors, with Muslims, with Jews. So they had some experience of mestizaje in Iberia. So they were dismantling this culture, but they were also curiously becoming a part of that culture. They were literally mingling their blood with the indigenous world, and a new kind of humanity was going to emerge in Mexico, a story that has profound lessons for us in our age of globalization. In many ways, Mexico prefigures and prophesies the age of globalization. And the very fitful and painful way that Mestizo identity emerged continues to play out in Mexican culture. So Places Left Unfinished for me was a way of trying to find a proper style for telling the story. And it meant that I had to use dreams, I had to use documentary reportage, I had to use my experiences in a sense of the interaction between worlds. That's why there's so many ghosts in Places Left Unfinished. You know, my ghosts had followed me to New York City. So Uncle Raul visits me in Astoria, across the river from Manhattan, and then later, in the last scene of the book, literally takes me flying over the city. And, you know, those, in a sense, were dreams. They, in one respect, we could think of them as dreams, but I really lived them as visitation. So I don't tell the reader that this is a dream or this is real. It's all sort of one mix and style of living that, you know, the book offers an account of. So, you know, with Places Left Unfinished, it was an attempt to reconnect our story here in San Antonio, growing up in San Antonio, traveling across the border, constantly growing up into North Mexico. And it really wasn't until much later that I came to know Central Mexico and the ruins of the great civilization that was vanquished at the time of the conquest. But I knew that I had to journey to make this book possible. So, you know, there are a couple of journeys that really are important in shaping the book. One is, of course, the journey from Veracruz to Mexico City. The Rutas Cortés, the route that the army took, the sort of small band of Spaniards took from the coast into the interior, and their encounters with various civilizations, the Tlaxcalteca people who become their allies against the Aztecs, particularly important. And the story of Malintzin, the woman who's given to Cortés as a gift, she's a Tlaxcalteca woman who's been already gifted once as a slave to the Maya, and so she's grown up in the Maya world in the Yucatan Peninsula, and then she's gifted again by the Maya people to Cortés. And remarkably, in the way these stories can only happen in reality, nobody could have planned this or scripted it better. Malintzin, because she was Tlaxcalteca, she spoke Nahuatl, the imperial language of the Mexica people, the Aztecs. And because she was gifted to the Maya as a slave, she learned Mayan. So she could translate from Nahuatl into Mayan, from Mayan into Nahuatl. And the Spaniards, when Cortés arrives, they knew that there were several shipwrecks. And I mentioned one of these the most important of these stories in the book. He rescues a priest who's been shipwrecked, and the priest reports to Cortés that there's another Spaniard named Gonzalo Guerrero who's also shipwrecked and living with a Maya. And they find Gonzalo Guerrero, but he, by that time, has a Mayan wife, and he has Mayan children, and he elects to stay with the Maya. He dies fighting with the Maya against the Spaniards some years later. But the priest, he's been shipwrecked and living with the Maya already long enough that he speaks Mayan. So that essentially made possible the translation chain, this delicate web of language that facilitated the conquest. Cortés could speak Spanish to the priest could speak Mayan to Malintzin could translate the Mayan into Nahuatl. And that essentially becomes the language chain for the initial part of the conquest. Ultimately, Malintzin learns to speak Spanish, and the story gets even more complicated. So that route is a very important one, the Ruta de Cortés. And that was very hard to find. The Mexicans they're not terribly proud of that story. They're very fitful and uneasy about the legacy of Cortés, and so it was very difficult to find that literally that map. The Ruta de Cortés has sort of been erased. And the other ruta that was really important was the ruta from San Antonio to Mexico City. So the umbilical cord that connected Mexico City and Tenochtitlan to our story here in San Antonio, to my family's story through Coahuila. And then I came to find another path to the villages in the distant mountains of Puebla, in the eastern borders of Puebla, up in the mountains in the village of San Miguel Tzinacapan, where I was looking for the origins of the volador ritual. The volador ritual, which encompasses much of the mythology and lore of the indigenous world, the calendar, the stories that tell of the descent of the gods from heavens to earth, all done in a ritual in which 5 flyers, dancers, climb up the pole. One dances on the top of that pole while the other 4 disentwine these braided ropes as they descend to earth. If you've had a chance to see the ritual, you can Google it and get a good sense of what it looks like. But it was very important for me to go to where that ritual came from and discover in that village world the extent to which the culture, the civilization that we think of as having been vanquished is in fact very much alive. The language is Nahuatl. They call it Mexicano, it's Mexica language. So it's the language is the common language. So if you speak Spanish, you're already one step removed from that world, the world of this sacred calendar that connects the time of the earth to the time of the cosmos. The belief systems, while couched in gods and saints of the Christian world, is in fact very much associated with specific gods of the Mexica world. So San Miguel is Quetzalcoatl, in different attire. And then I also realized in that village, I was about 1.5 feet, 2 feet taller than most everybody else, and I was hairier, and so my story wasn't just an indigenous story. I was a product of this Mestizo story, and to tell the story fully, ultimately I would have to also tell the Spanish side of the story. And that book, the book that followed Places Left Unfinished, really goes to that story. But you know, what ultimately for me I think has been the learning around this book was that we all have ancestral stories to tell. And that in a sense, our ancestors are always beckoning to us to tell their stories. Our lives themselves are evocations of ancestral presence. So it's very different from the idea of the kind of the sovereign individual, that we are ourselves alone, entire, kind of the imperial sovereign self. I always saw my life deeply connected to this ancestral journey. And you know, somewhere along the way, when I was trying to finish Places Left Unfinished, I was sort of like having writer's block and needed to shake up the crystal ball a bit, you know, get all those little snowflakes flying in one of those little crystal balls again. And so I started doing, I wanted to read stuff that wouldn't have anything to do with the story I was telling, this old Mexican story about families in San Antonio, old San Antonio. And so I read some Egyptology, and I read some new cosmology coming out of the Santa Fe Institute. And then I started reading about genealogical genetics, and you know, thinking that that was a very distant subject from the story that I wanted to tell in Places. But in fact, it became the spark not only for a new way of thinking about the story I was telling in Places, but the spark of the new book. And you know, if you don't know about the genealogical genetics, there have been lots of TV shows now. There's the one that's happening on NBC. I don't know if it's still on, the one called Who Do You Think You Are? You know, where Jennifer Lopez has done one. I think Jennifer Aniston has done one. So they're chronicling the Jennifers. And the amazing thing about this science is that, you know, for all of the discussions in Places of forgetting, the way that we forget our stories. You know, you ask somebody, well, where do you come from? Well, you know, we really don't know. You know, we know grandfather came from Poteet, but you know, we really don't know where the family came from, where that. So, for all of the presence of forgetting in our lineages, the discovery of DNA, the molecular structure of DNA, only 60 years ago, led to the discovery in the 1980s, really, that our DNA contains in it the entire record of our ancestry. So all of your ancestors, every single one, is salvaged, inscribed, forever recorded in our blood. So each one of us has the entire record of our humanity. So if one of us survives, you know, we've got the entire story. And the amazing thing about that record, not only is it comprehensive, but it is time-coded. So we can go into our blood, read the entire chronicle of our ancestors, and know when they were where by correlating it with other people's genetic samples. So what's emerging in our time is a reconstruction of what the inventor of this new science, a guy named Luigi Cavalli-Sforza, he says we're going to be able to recreate the entire epic of the great human diasporas. We're going to be able to roll back time, in a sense, and revisit all of the journeys our ancestors have made. You know, and when you look at that story, what you see is that we're all mestizos. Every one of us is a mestizo. And that mestizos, in a sense, tell a story of humanity that's very different from the one that we've received about nationhood, borders, documentation of travel, and the predicament of the undocumented. And in a sense, the Mestizo journey tells us that we're from everywhere. If you go farther and farther back, you'll see that your ancestral origins is more like a fractal than a line. It's more like a panorama than one single thread. And so Mestizo history tells us that we're from everywhere. And if we're from everywhere, then humans ultimately are going to claim a right to be anywhere. That's a new human ethic that's going to emerge directly from these new understandings of the science. And if we are from everywhere and we have a right to be anywhere, then no borders are legitimate. So that story, that huge story, for me at least, began with the story of our families here in San Antonio. So each one of us has this compromiso, this obligation, at some point to testify to these stories. That is a part not only of this compromiso to the ancestral past, but to who we are becoming as a nation. We need to find ways to share these stories in public spaces, libraries, museums, universities, schools. So what's happening in Arizona right now should give us great alarm. The idea that anyone would want to limit our understanding of the past has got to give us great alarm. And the idea that it's happening precisely in schools is just it's a chilling development. I was just in Chicago at a conference of writers this weekend, and it was a huge matter of concern among writers. Even if getting banned probably helps your book sales. I think I'm going to end there and maybe just see if we could have a dialogue. There's some images here, but better just to talk among ourselves. Images that kind of relate to the book. If we have time, I'll show you some of them. Any thoughts? Questions? Yes.